Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. In my last video, we saw how overholding, the holding of values beyond the prescribed length, particularly in accompaniments that were based on harmonic material, was a widespread practice in harpsichord playing throughout the 18th century. I offered the first two preludes from the first volume of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier as an example, but also showed excerpts from works by Chopin and Mozart. Overholding remained a common feature of piano playing well into the 20th century, and we saw how Chopin, who by the 1840s had introduced the use of extended pedaling, was still overholding in passages where the writing allowed finger legato. We saw how that was true in the early Nocturne in F major, Opus 15, number 1, but also in the late Nocturne in B major, Opus 62, number 1. The first page in both pieces shows an obvious strategy in place. The pedal is implemented when the left hand cannot successfully connect a bass note and the continuation of an accompaniment in the tenor register, for example, or when a right hand roll would be too large to be physically held. However, when the writing is contained within the reach of an octave in both hands, then the pedal is dispensed with. In both nocturnes, the marking legato appears at the beginning, reminding the performer that the piece requires finger legato, meaning the physical connection of sounds, because the pedal here is used sparingly or not systematically in patterns like in the case of other works. The marking legato in this case is not a request for what legato has come to mean in piano playing today, a long sense of phrase or a beautifully shaped melody, but is offered as a basic piece of technical instruction. It warns the performer that this opening page may not rely on the consistent use of the sustained pedal. This is because the writing presents many instances in which finger legato is the desired technique to execute the section successfully. And so this approach invites and establishes a sound world that is very different from that of the Nocturne in D-flat major, Opus 27, number 2, where continuous pedal markings create a radiance in the melody that is not found in unpedaled playing. I can already hear some viewers commenting in regard to passages in which Chopin doesn't write pedal markings. Well, that's because in those moments the pedaling is obvious. Or that's because he didn't want to micromanage the performer. Or marking the pedal for each instance so close to each other would make it impossible to mark every single pedal application. My response is, well, it's also true that some of the pedal markings he did write are quite obvious. In the Nocturne in B major, Opus 62, number 1, the ones for the first two measures, for example. Or the one that connects the bass note to the tenor in measure 4. Or the very detailed pedaling in the recapitulation where a chain of trills reproposes the main theme. And doesn't it seem all too coincidental that every single time Chopin chooses not to mark the use of the pedal, the overholding of various voices is either specified or at least implied, given that the left-hand writing spans intervals that are an octave or less. In the case of the Nocturne in B major, Opus 62, number 1, The writing is quite contrapuntal, and the double stemming that Chopin notated shows four distinct voices, moving melodically and independently. But that didn't prevent him from indicating the use of the pedal for these moments. So why didn't he? In this passage, for example, he could have marked the pedal for each eighth note, which would have preserved the clarity that he intended by not pedaling them. But the pedal appears only in the last eighth note, where the left hand plays a tenth, an interval that many pianists would find difficult to reach. The interpretive implications of the term legato in early 19th century playing are at the core of several important points I'd like to share because they affect the way we use the sustain pedal on modern instruments. On today's pianos, observing the text faithfully in passages like the ones we just saw poses serious technical and interpretive challenges because it is nearly impossible to produce an equally successful legato as the one achieved on the instruments from Chopin's time without the use of the sustain pedal. On pianos from Chopin's time, the action was shallower and lighter, which provided greater ease in creating physical connections. But there's an even more important aspect which pertains to the dampers. When releasing a note or chord, no matter the duration, the dampers did not immediately interrupt the vibration of the strings, and as a result, a veiled resonance emerged. This reverberation manifested itself in the form of a decaying after sound effect, quicker in the treble and progressively slower as one reached the bass, even when playing staccato. On Pleyel pianos, this reverberation was present both on grand pianos and the so-called pianinos, small upright, double-strung instruments made by the Parisian firm since the 1830s, which Chopin particularly loved. Here is a performance on this 1839 pianino, owned by my good friend Amerigo Olivier Fadini, in a performance in Georges Sand's dining room at her family chateau in Nohant, where Chopin spent 7 summers. This veiled resonance allowed a pianist to dispense with the use of the sustain pedal in many instances, because most of the minimal voids caused by the physical limitation of the hand would have been supported by this built-in resonance. Put more simply, each time a key is released, there is a slight delay in the arrival of the silence that follows that release, and this delay helps the connection of notes or chords that on modern pianos would definitely sound separated if played without the sustain pedal. The delay also guarantees greater connection and makes the use of the sustain pedal less essential. As technological advances were introduced in the manufacturing of pianos, this after sound produced by the dampers coming in contact with the strings was viewed as an undesirable flaw. Piano makers worked toward reducing it and eventually eliminated it. It's a simple fact that explains why all piano schools of the first half of the 19th century addressed the importance of extreme legato playing. The veiled reverberation, unavoidable, made the use of the pedal less binding, but also allowed to achieve successfully what pianists today are forced to create by applying myriads of small pedal changes. The equivalent effect on modern pianos would be what we call today half pedal, even though it would correspond to a much smaller degree than half, depending on the instrument. To give it a generic quantification, I'd say 10% pedal. The sudden interruption of sound that the dampers produce on modern instruments was not achievable on 1830s pianos, and it is precisely such exactness that limits a strict adherence to Chopin's instructions in unpedaled passages such as the opening page of the nocturnes in F major, opus 15, number 1, and in B major, opus 62, number 1. The choice to play without the constant use of the sustain pedal prompted pianists to use a greater degree of finger legato than any pianist is willing or even capable of doing today. For the sake of clarity, let's dissect the property of sound decay on Chopin's pianos versus modern pianos. It is true that given equal volume of attack, the resonance on pianos from Chopin's time was less prolonged, meaning playing a note or chord on an 1840s Pleyel would result in a sound that is maybe 25% shorter than on a modern instrument, given the same volume applied. If the sustain pedal sustains a note or chord in forte for, say, 40 seconds on modern pianos, on Chopin's pianos it rang for about 30 seconds before reaching silence. But holding the sustain pedal for an entire measure in a slow-paced piece for what would be perhaps 4 to 5 seconds would produce a very similar outcome on old and new instruments. So the excuse that Chopin's pianos resonated differently is not a valid point, I'm afraid. We can discuss the difference in sound between historical and modern instruments, and they would be legitimate points to make. But the two resonate differently only in the way that lengths that are never found in Chopin's music would be affected. When we encounter pedal markings that encompass an entire measure, pedals which do blur the melody, and there are many such cases, then we need to consider the harmony, not the melody. In other words, we need to look, most of the time, at the left hand. We begin to notice how what Chopin seems to desire through a long pedal is that the length of a bass note be held through a specific harmony, or that that specific harmony be preserved in its totality, not that the end result be transparency. Because, as I just mentioned, whether the melody blurred or not does not seem to be a concern for Chopin. A blurred melody is the byproduct of preserving the harmony intact, collateral damage, or necessary evil, if you will. The Nocturne in C minor, opus 48, number 1, offers an opportunity to observe this concept in action. We are fortunate that the two manuscripts of the Nocturne that were created survived. One of them was prepared by Chopin himself, and the second by Julian Fontana, Chopin's self-appointed assistant, by copying Chopin's once it was completed. These two manuscripts were sent to the publishing firms Schlesinger in Paris and Breitkopf und Härtel in Leipzig, Germany, so that the engravers at both firms would have a point of reference to engrave the piece. A third edition, published by Vessel in London, was based on the proofs of the French edition. Only the copy made by Fontana is accessible today because Chopin's copy is held in a private collection. And even though there's a facsimile published by Jean-Jacques Eigeldinger, one of the leading Chopin scholars today, in 1986, the publication is not easy to find, and that's unfortunate. In any case, when Chopin asked Fontana to make a copy of an original manuscript, Fontana was asked to copy the text without all the interpretive directions, such as dynamics, articulation, pedal markings, etc. Chopin would then add all the pertinent notation. So while this is Fontana's handwriting, rather similar to Chopin's, it must be mentioned, at the same time all the interpretive markings are in Chopin's hand. As we examine the manuscript, we notice how Chopin consistently applied pedal markings to the harmony, often in half-measure groups. There are groups in which the melody doesn't blur, such as the two groups in measure 1 and the first one in measure 2. But in many others, extreme blurriness emerges. For example, the second half of measure 6. Did you hear how observing the original pedaling leads to the accumulation of all the notes that the right hand plays? Let's hear it again. Many pianists feel like they have to correct this blurriness by changing the pedal somewhere along the way, in the case of measure 6, on the fourth beat most likely, which of course mitigates the problem, but unfortunately creates inconsistency in the left hand. It also changes the harmony. In fact, the C that is supposed to support the entire half measure is shortened, and now A becomes the lowest note, which is then understood as the new bass note, while it is the C that should be the only main bass note of this half measure. I'd like to open a brief parenthesis here and discuss the signs and symbols that Chopin chose in notating the use of the sustain pedal. When the pedal is applied, Chopin writes PED, and when it should be released, he marks a cross superimposed to a circle. Sometimes this symbol was preserved by the engravers in the early editions, but for the most part it was turned into an asterisk, which has become standardized by pretty much all editions today. The placement of the release sign is single-handedly one of the most misunderstood and problematic aspects in Chopin's music. In his manuscripts, Chopin makes it extremely clear that a pedal release occurs at a specific point. In the case of the Nocturne in C minor we just viewed, at the very end of a measure, for example, for the second pedal marking of that measure. But that wasn't always the case when the first editions were prepared. I'd like to illustrate what often happened by referring to the waltz in E-flat major opus 18, one of Chopin's most original creations from his early Parisian days. I'm using this waltz as an example because the left-hand accompaniment is based on a continuous pattern, each measure represented by a bass note in beat 1 and two chords in beats 2 and 3. We see how Chopin marked the pedal, each application encompassing an entire measure. This is consistently the case for long stretches, unless the third beat of a measure presents a new harmony, in which case the pedal ends whenever the new harmony is introduced. There are cases in which the harmony remains the same for more than a single measure, and the pedal marked reflects that. This manuscript was prepared by Chopin as the basis for the first French edition, published by Schlesinger in Paris. The proofs that Schlesinger prepared were then sent to Breitkopf und Härte in Leipzig, Germany, and Wessel in London, England, so that the publication of the waltz could be carried out by the two firms as well. The first French edition shows that the engraver followed Chopin's pedal releases. We see that the asterisk is quite consistently placed past the third beat of a measure. Yet the engraver in Leipzig, who was using this very score as reference, chose to align the release signs with the third beat of each measure. I chose this waltz as an example to illustrate this recurring problem. The engraver's decision to change the placement of the releases is inexplicable, but it was not uncommon in the way most music was published. I'm left wondering whether pianists at the time understood these releases as not to be taken literally, particularly when continuous pedal was intended, while it is our modern, more analytical mindset that assigns these symbols an exact meaning. In any case, this is why it is of paramount importance to rely on the manuscripts that have survived, and thankfully there are quite a few, to understand Chopin's intentions in regard to pedaling, because his markings were often reinterpreted. And because of the predominant role of the editions published during Chopin's lifetime, particularly the German edition and later publications throughout the second half of the 19th and more or less the first three-quarters of the 20th century, the pedal markings in those editions generated interpretive traditions. We are so used to hearing the pedal being released or changed on the third beat rather than the long pedals marked by Chopin that we have normalized their effect. So much so that when pianists perform such passages according to the pedaling Chopin indicated, not that there are many really, their pedaling is immediately labeled as excessive and incorrect. We now briefly move on to pedal markings that are often considered irrationally long, like the ones in the opening of the sonata in B-flat minor opus 35, or in the prelude in B-flat minor from opus 28. We can see that in both cases, each pedal marking applies to the harmony. Chopin seems to say, if the harmony doesn't change, then the pedal should remain depressed for the entire duration of that specific harmonic block. The pedal is then changed when the harmony changes. If, as we discussed a few minutes ago, the effect of long applications of sustained pedal obtain more or less the same effect on Chopin's playels as they do on modern pianos, then these instances can only be understood as part of particularly aesthetic principles that we have a hard time relating to because of very different parameters in regard to what sounds good. I myself honored the ones in the sonata. Here is the outcome. I have not recorded the prelude in B-flat minor, but you would certainly hear me observe the pedal markings that Chopin prescribed, and I did so when I performed it. In the prelude, it is particularly rare to hear pianists observe the original pedal markings. And as an example of someone who really doesn't do that, here is the performance of Ivo Pogorelic, who uses almost no pedal whatsoever. The prelude in B-flat minor presents an instance in which we need to be cautious as to what edition we use. The Paderewski edition from 1949, though scholarly in its own time and still valid in some respects today, proposes a renewed pedaling with each half measure. This was done probably with the intention to correct what may have been perceived as excessive resonance. Still, there is no explanation in the commentary as to why the original pedal markings were modified, which is unfortunate. So, what do we gather from all this? There's one fundamental aspect in the way Chopin notates the sustain pedal. When we see a long pedal marking that seems to produce excessive resonance, we cannot simply dismiss it by considering it an oversight on Chopin's part, or as applying only to the instruments of his time. While it's true that instruments from the 1830s and 40s offered a different sound world, Chopin's pedal markings ringing a certain way on modern pianos produce an effect that is very similar to that on historical instruments. When it comes to unpedaled passages, our modern instruments do not easily allow us to obtain the kind of sonic connection that is possible on early instruments, and so a moderate use of the sustain pedal to compensate for the lack of connectivity should be factored in. But we should also keep in mind that our modern understanding of what legato is and how it's obtained differs radically from the physical approach that was necessary when not relying so heavily on the sustain pedal. We might want to be mindful of the effect that Chopin had in mind, which is often more essential, devoid of overlapping resonance, an effect that is often missed because of the generous pedaling that we tend to apply. Yet, at times, Chopin deliberately bathes a passage, a measure, a section, in a kind of resonance that was intentional, an aesthetic statement, if you will, but that, let's be honest, today makes us uncomfortable. I hope one day we'll all be able to make sense of these incredible contradictions and correct our perception, or at least become more accepting of something that we generally find unfamiliar without dismissing it as wrong. I'll return to the idea of legato while pedaling in my next video with more examples of unusual pedaling and some of the contradictions we can detect in modern playing, but also with some ideas about how Chopin may have used the left pedal. See you next time.